Hello everybody, today we're taking a look at the Hobbymate D6 dual Lite charger and T240 power supply. Let's take a look at the charger first. So on the face of the charger, you have a combination channel exit button, a 2.4-inch color LCD display, a scroll wheel that has a button as well. On the front, you have both of your channel outputs, XT60 connectors, and balance ports. On the right, you have a micro USB port for updating the firmware and a multifunction port. On the back, you have a USB-C port that's rated up to 45 watts, a USB-A port that's rated at 2.1 amps, a cooling fan output, and a DC input that's rated from 10.5 volts up to 30 volts. On the back, you have two little kickstands here that you can use to put the charger at an angle. Let's take a look at the specification sheet that comes with it. You have the DC input voltage, charge current 15 amps times 2, charge power 300 watts times 2 for an input voltage greater than 22 volts, regenerative discharge current all the way up to 15 amps times 2, internal discharge 12 watts, balance ports capable of 5 watts each, external discharge all the way up to 300 watts for both channels, regenerative discharge, same 300 watts for both channels, supports all the different battery chemistries, has a balance current of an amp times 2, discharge of between 1 and 3 amps times 2, external discharge current up to 15 amps. We talked about our USB outputs, temperature ranges for storage, minus 20 to 60 degrees Celsius, operating 0 to 40 degrees Celsius. The screen is a 2.4-inch, 320 by 240 dot matrix LCD, and the dimensions and the weight. Okay, so let's get this powered up. So you can power the charger with any DC source between 10.5 and 30 volts. So that could be, if you already have a power supply, you can use that, or we're going to talk about the Hobbymate option on the T240 power supply later. Or if you're at the field, you can use a car battery, or you can even use a big LiPo like I'm going to do here. This is a 4-cell LiPo to power it up. So it starts off doing a self-check mode every time you plug in a battery. So let's go through the charger setup menu first. You hold down the scroll wheel, and then you can go to task parameters. And you can see here, you have safety timer. I like to set that has a pretty high value. I usually like to set it for about an hour and a half, 90 minutes. Max capacity, I usually set it around 10,000 or whatever you think might be the maximum capacity of the largest battery you might charge. The rest of these settings are fine. Then you go to system parameters, and you have language options here. You have regenerative discharge. We'll talk about that later. Input power is fine, default. Minimum input voltage. So if you're using a battery like a big LiPo, it's a good idea to set that so that if it goes, you don't want to drain this battery too far by charging. For a 4-cell LiPo, I'll usually set it about 14.5 volts. Adjust that to whatever is the proper voltage you don't want your battery being charged from. To go down lower than. LCD backlights, volumes, completion signal repeats. You can name the device, and that's it in that menu. We have tools we'll talk about later. Calibration for channels 1 and 2. You can do the self-checking. You can reinitiate that. Again, it does it at startup. Reset the factory settings. System info. Gives you hardware, software, and serial numbers. And that's it. Now let's charge a battery. First of all, we need to select a channel. So we can select channel 1 here as indicated in the upper left-hand corner of the LCD. And so let's plug in a battery. So this is a 4-cell 1300 milliamp hour battery. So plug in main lead and then the balance lead with the ground all the way to the right. It's got a little indication there. This is a 1300 milliamp hour pack. So we're going to go to charge. Let's look at some of the other setting options here real quick. You got power supply. We'll talk about that in a minute. Discharges. We'll talk about that. Balance. Regenerative discharge. We'll talk more detail about this new function called sync charge here in a moment. So we'll go to charge. LiPo is correct. Other options are other types of LiPo batteries. We have nickel batteries, lead batteries, Eneloops. Smart batteries was at the top, so we'll pick LiPo. Cell voltage, 4.2. There are options. Good idea to stick with 4.2 for standard LiPos. It knows that it's a 4-cell because of the balance connection. Otherwise, if you don't have the balance connection connected, you would have to select the cell count. Current setting, we can change that if we wanted to. It goes all the way up to 15 amps. That's the maximum charge current per channel. I'm going to charge at 1C, so I'm going to leave it at 1.3 amps. And then we can start the charge. So right now here, it's going to show you the present voltage of the pack and the individual cell voltages for each cell. Give it a moment, and we can use the scroll wheel here, and it's going to give us the internal resistance for each cell. But we'll come back. It takes a couple minutes for that to populate. All right, here we go. So this is the internal resistance for each one of the cells in the pack. This is just a relative number that you use to compare how healthy your individual cells are. The lower number, the better. You want to see them fairly consistent and at the same time being lower. It's essentially what you want to end up doing is maybe note these when you get a new pack and then see how they change over time. Okay, so this will continue to charge at, this is the 1.3 amps we selected. It's at 21 watts. You can see the pack voltage has gone up some, and so far we've put 26 milliamp hours in the pack. So let's say that we want to hook up another pack. So this is a 6-cell pack. We'll plug it in. Again, able to do this because it's a dual channel charger. Plug in the balance lead. Make sure everything's set up right. Just double check. Charge LiPo. It knows it's a 6S. This is a 1.3 milliamp hour pack. We'll start that. So it's starting to charge now on channel 2, the 6-cell. And you can press this. You can go back and monitor them both at the same time. So these will continue to charge till they're finished. And so with that, I'll go ahead and stop it so we can look at some of the other functions. I'll just hold down the scroll wheel if I want to, and it'll stop both of them. Okay, so let's talk about some of the discharge functions. So we'll go to our task 1 settings. We'll select the first one here, discharge. All right, so we have a LiPo battery. You can change the discharge, what you take the cells down to. I use 3.8 volts typically because that's storage voltage. It knows it's a 4S battery because its balance plug's connected in. You have your discharge current up to 3 amps. Essentially, this charger is capable of discharging at 12 watts internally, and you essentially start it. So here it's showing the individual cell voltages, and it'll discharge the battery. You can go over and select that channel. It'll discharge the battery until it reaches 3.8 volts. And switching over to channel 2 automatically, so if I wanted to discharge this pack. I'll just disconnect this pack for now. So I can go ahead and stop that. And then we'll take a look at another discharge function. And this is very similar. This is called storage. Essentially does the same thing as discharge, but it automatically, in this function, it'll discharge if it's above the cell voltages, or it'll charge if it's below the cell voltage. So it does either one depending on if it's high or low. So with that, we started that in discharge mode. It'll look very similar as what we just looked at. So we exit out of there. stop that. Now we can take a look at regenerative discharge. So one of the things I want to show you, well, before we start this, we need to double check a setting. And you don't have to do this typically at the beginning. So you end up going to System Parameters, Regenerative Discharge. And so in Regenerative Discharge, you take the power of the battery that's normally being charged and you put it back in the battery that it was charged from, supply battery. And so what you want to do is you want to, when you transfer the power, it's kind of, think about it as like reverse charging. And so you don't want to charge this battery too much or at too high a rate, because this battery has a limit of how much you want to put in it. So this is a 4-cell LiPo. And so the maximum voltage on this pack, 4.2 times 4 is 16.8 volts. So I like to set the max voltage according to my supply battery. And the max current also to the supply battery, as this one is a 4.2 milliamp hour pack. I don't want to charge it more than 1C, so I'm going to leave that at 4.2. But of course, you can change that if you wanted to. I think all the way up to 15 amps. So now that we checked that, we can exit out. Go back to our regenerative discharge. 4.2 amps current setting. So that means it's going to pull. This will end up discharging this battery much faster. You can see here it's already up to 4.2 amps. And you can see the milliamp hours being pulled out of this battery at that rate. So if we let that discharge down to 3.8 volts per cell, then it would be complete. But I'll go ahead and stop it. And I'll show you another way to discharge batteries. So for this, we're going to disconnect all the batteries, and we're going to power the charger off the battery we want to discharge. We'll select the battery. We're going to select external discharge this time. And we're going to do, it is a 4-cell. We're going to discharge it to 3.8 volts per cell. We can change that if we wanted to. But now it's called an external discharge because you're essentially going to be discharging into some sort of resistive load. Essentially, it's going to dump it as heat. And so with that, I have this little projector light bulb that I use for this. Plug it into the output and start the task. So here you can see it's again discharging at the whatever amps we selected, somewhat dependent upon capability of your resistive load. But here you can see that it's discharging very quickly, but this is not as energy efficient as putting it back into a supply battery because this is just wasting it to heat. But again, works to discharge batteries quickly. And that'll take it all the way to 3.8 volts. When it reaches 3.8 volts per cell, it'll stop. So we can stop that. You can also adjust the current as you go if you wanted to. We'll stop it. Put that aside. Kind of hot, got to watch out for that. And we'll go back to our main supply battery. And take a look at the rest of the functions. So we'll select our channel 1 again. And we've already done all the discharge functions. Might want to point out balance. Balance essentially, what it does is it just discharges the cells to all be common voltage. It doesn't take them necessarily to 3.8 volts or whatever the case is, but it's essentially discharges to, so all the cells are essentially balanced. That's it. So let's take a look at power supply. This is actually a very handy function. So you can essentially turn this into a benchtop power supply. So here you have, I have a voltmeter here, put it on DC volts. I'll plug it into channel 1 output. And you have an output voltage here you can select. This is 5 volts all the way up. It goes all the way up to 24 volts. I'll select 5. You can select the power output, maximum 300 watts. You can make it less if you want. And you hit start. So here you go, 5 volts. Now let's say I want to increase that. Just click that. And let's say I want to go up to 10 volts. There's 10 volts. And then I can, again, go all the way up to 24. 24 volts. Very handy. And actually you have 2 power supplies, is you can do both of these independently, channel 1 and channel 2. So we can stop this. Take a look at some of the other functions. Next, let's go into tools. So here you have the ability to do some, this is what utilizes the multifunction port on the right side of the charger. So this is pulse width modulated measurement. So this right here, if you wanted to hook up a receiver, a pulse width modulated channel on a receiver, like a servo output on a receiver, you could plug it in this port and it could tell you the output of that channel in microseconds. You know, usually between 1,000 and 2,000 microseconds is the output, and actually you can measure that. That's very handy for testing receivers. We can get out of there, and you have this servo test. Let me show you the auto test. So I have a servo here. You can see that the output is going from low to high. Plug that in. It says signal is closest to me. There you go. So you can sit there and you can change the output. If you want to, you can make it go less. Going to 1500 would be about half the amount. Close enough. So you can do servo testing. The manual test is very much the same, where you just essentially dial in what you want. All right. And the last tool is PPM output. So from here, what you would do is you would hook up a flight controller or something like that, have a PPM, use the PPM input on the flight controller. If you're trying to test that flight controller, you could simulate each one of the channel outputs. So that's very handy for testing flight controllers. Well, with that, we'll go back. Go back, select our channel. So there's another new function here that has not been on any of the Hobbymate chargers in the past, and that's called sync charge. And so what this does, this essentially combines the output of channel 1 and channel 2 together so that you are no longer limited by 15 amps. You can actually turn, both of them combined, you can go up to 22 amps. So this is for charging very large packs. So what you need to do for this, you need to have a Y cable. Like this, essentially puts channel 1 and channel 2 together. So I have a battery here. This is a small battery, but it'll work for the demonstration. Usually this is designed for large packs that you want to use more than 15 amps. Plug in the balance port. In this case, it knows it's a 4S. So here, we can go all the way up, no longer limited by 15. We go all the way up to 22 amps. I'm not going to do that because this is just a smaller pack, but just for demonstration purposes, I'll go ahead and just go to my normal 1.3, start the task. So right now you can see it says channel 1 and channel 2 together at the top, because in this configuration you're using, the combined output of both channels. Very handy function for charging very large packs. So let's exit out of this. Hold that down the shuttle button. And what we can do now is talk about the T240 power supply. So this power supply, you can buy it as a combination or separately with the charger. It comes with a power cord. It comes with this little pigtail here to connect up the DC output of the power supply to the charger. So if we look around the power supply, start on the back here, you got the AC input that's good from 100 volts up to 240, from 50 to 60 hertz. So all the different power in the world it's compatible with. You have the fan output. You have the DC output here. That's at 29 volts. Again, 240 watts. On the front, you have a USB-C connector. Again, 45 watts on this one as well. And USB-A at 2.1 amps. And it has the same kick pad style feet on the bottom. So let's get this powered up. So you got the power here. Plug in our pigtail. We have the charger. You'll see here, actually got magnets on the charger. So they can stick together if you want to. Plug in our pigtail. And there we go. So now you can charge your batteries and everything else that you want to do. Nice form factor. They're the same size. And so with that, these are two made to go together if you decide you want to purchase it that way. So we can unplug that. So I also want to talk about the size. So this Hobbymate charger, this dual output charger, is the smallest charger that Hobbymate has put out to date. So here is a very popular, this is the D6 Dual Pro charger. You can kind of get an idea of the size difference. This one has the AC power supply built into it. This is separate. So if you don't need it, you don't buy it. Takes up a lot less space. This has all the functions that the D6 Pro has, with some extra tools and the sync function, sync charging. So, so this actually has a few more functions than this does. And the other charger that Hobbymate has is the Speed H6. This is just a single output charger. Of course, it's slightly smaller compared to the D6 because it's a single channel. It does have an AC power supply built into it. You can see it's roughly the same size this as the Lite charger, except it's deeper. So with that concludes our review of the Hobbymate D6 Dual Lite charger.